seated. While Jesus has used figurative language up to this point in Matthew's gospel, this is the first time he describes it as a parable. Parables are meant to be stories of the everyday, but as teaching devices, they're supposed to be something to tease your brain. There are lots of possible interpretations. Chapter 13, where we are in Matthew's gospel, is full of parables. That's where we'll be for the next few weeks. So as we read through the parables, it's important to ask, what part doesn't make sense? What part makes me, well, wait a minute, that doesn't seem quite right? And with today's parable, the parable of the sower, Jesus provides an interpretation, but that might not be the only interpretation. The usual use of interpretation focuses on what kind of soil am I when we hear this parable. Has anyone heard a sermon like that before? I see some hands. How do I become good soil? But that makes sense. And that allegorical explanation that Jesus gives in the text shifts the focus from God to us. And all of these parables are Jesus saying what the reign of God is like. Not in its final consummation, not streets of gold, not pearly gates, but that the kingdom has come near. And Jesus is saying through these parables what that looks like. So this interpretation about soil and hearing the word is one way to understand it. But it also gets us past, it short circuits the wondering, what doesn't make sense? Well, wait a minute. That doesn't seem quite right. So here again, the parable of the sower without the allegorical interpretation. Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. What doesn't make sense in that story? Are there any gardeners or farmers who can notice something that doesn't quite track? Yes, Dawn? Dawn said, why would you be throwing your seeds on the rocks and on the path? Exactly. Like, when I think about the gorgeous wheat fields in eastern Washington, seeds don't get intentionally scattered so broadly that they wind up on the road or in the ditch. The ground is prepared. The farmers live with very thin profit margins as it is. In the first century, people are farming for their own food primarily, and then if there's something left over, they can sell it. Seeds are a hot commodity, and you cannot waste them. This sower doesn't even have to worry about the seeds being proprietary information, worry about Monsanto if he keeps extras. So this parable, while we can understand it and interpret it about having to be about us and what kind of soil we are, the bigger message Jesus is trying to tease out, the message about God's reign that is at hand, is that God sows God's grace and love with reckless abandon. That there's so much available that none can be wasted. It's not possible. And that's God's grace for us, and how God sows the good news through Jesus of God's reign at hand. And in Paul's letter to the Romans today, that's what he is saying too. That God sends Jesus to us, even though humanity might reject Jesus, even though humanity did reject Jesus. God could have just not. And yet, God did send Jesus because of God's ineffable, inestimable love for us. And despite Jesus being rejected, Jesus still defeats sin and death in the flesh, saving creation from all condemnation, as Paul opens the chapter. So while we're used to, or might be used to, hearing about the kinds of soil we might be, when I'm being honest, I'm every kind of those soils at some point in my life, every kind of those soils at some point in most weeks. But God doesn't give up. God doesn't hoard God's love. God doesn't wait until the right person or the right time in this parable of the sower. God just scatters. And there's her voice now. Scatters and showers us with grace. And there are times that when we are in the right place, when the Spirit has prepared us, we are the good soil that leads to 30 or 60 or 100-fold, whatever that means. And it's an invitation for us, when we grow with God, when the seeds of God's love land just right, to share that good news too. Not with the people we are certain will come to church or will become Episcopalians, but with the people we think could hear some good news, and who might reject us, but to not worry about that. To remember that that's God's work. Ours is to hear the good news, and if it's good enough for us, share it with other folks. Sometimes that'll be a postcard campaign that yields 3 people. And yet, that's 3 more than we had before. So as we think about how we engage our community, what good news we offer, we have to remember that God's love cannot be contained and isn't carefully chosen. And then as we love, we need to remember to do the same. To love without bounds, to love recklessly, and to share the love and good news we've known through Jesus all around us, scattering with reckless abandon. Let those with ears to hear listen. Amen.